Hey guys, my name is Trevor Sullivan and welcome back to my video channel. Thanks so much for joining me for another video in the Rust programming tutorial video series. You can check out the full playlist of this tutorial series on my video channel at youtube.com/Trevor Sullivan. If you head over to the featured playlists down here, you can find the Rust programming tutorial playlist. And you can also go to the playlists tab on my channel and see the Rust playlist along with several other playlists that I've made available. So if you like this video and the other content on my channel, make sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel. That really helps support the channel, leave a comment, and help others to find these videos as well. So the topic today is going to be on the Rust Inquire crate. Now, the Rust Inquire crate is a crate that helps us to prompt for user input into our application. So imagine that you're building an application that maybe deploys cloud resources. Maybe you're building an application that writes data or updates data inside of something like a MySQL database or a MongoDB database or something of that nature. Or maybe you're building some kind of text-based game and you want to be able to prompt your user for or player in that case for some information like what is your player's name, right? Or what is the player class that they want to play as, or other types of input information that might feed into the game. Well, we can use the Rust Inquire crate here for that purpose. And this is a relatively well supported, moderately popular crate with about 1.8 thousand stars on GitHub right now that is open source that helps us to accomplish exactly those types of tasks. So the Inquire crate, again, it's an open source project. You can go out, find it on github.com/mikhailmello/inquire. And then basically what this does is it allows us to prompt for user input inside of a terminal-based application. So this isn't the type of crate that you would use if you're building like a graphical application using something like Iced or other types of GUI frameworks that are available out there. But this is more something that you would use for a terminal-based application where you need to be able to prompt for user input, kind of like the examples that you can see right down here. So some of the different types of controls, so to speak, that we have available are things like text-based inputs. We also have a optional date picker that's not available by default, but there is a feature that you can install when you install the Inquire crate that allows you to enable the date picker feature. There's also an inline text editor that's an optional feature as well, hence the asterisks next to each of those features that you see right here. We also have something called a select option and a multi-select. So those are really simple where think of like a drop-down box in a graphical user interface, maybe on a website somewhere, where you can select an option from a drop-down list. That's kind of like what a select is, where you can select a specific item from a list, or with multi-select, think of that as a drop-down box that has checkboxes next to each item, where I can actually select multiple items out of the entire list, right? So that's some simple types of controls that we have. There's also a really basic confirmation, so it'll just kind of give you a Boolean true or false. Has the user authorized the operation or not? That's just kind of there for things like sanity checks. If you're maybe doing cloud deployments or something and you want that additional user confirmation to hit, yes, I am okay with going ahead and deploying this change out to my environment, then you can use the confirmation prompt there without having to write any extra code to check for, Y or yes or N for no or something like that. You also have the ability to prompt with custom types here if you'd like to. And then finally, there's a password type here that allows you to mask the input when you're actually typing into the terminal so that if somebody's looking over your shoulder physically at your screen or using some kind of remoting software to be able to see your screen, then they're not going to be able to see what's actually on the screen itself. So it just puts kind of asterisks in place just to kind of mask the user input there. This is a really nice crate for just building really bare bones applications. I would generally encourage you to kind of get familiar with this for really basic applications, but if you're looking to build something that's really fully featured and something that's going to be a much larger application, you probably want to take a look at the Ratatouille crate instead. So if we go out here and just do a search for Ratatouille Rust, this is a pretty mature framework that you can use to build graphical applications that run inside of the terminal. You can actually create different like window panes and be able to switch between panes and capture user input and all that kind of thing. So there's a lot more complexity that goes into Ratatouille based applications. But if you want to build a full featured application that has lots of different functionality, then Ratatouille is probably the right option for you. But if you're just looking to build a kind of bare bones application that can prompt for some basic user input, then the Inquire crate should have you covered there. All right, so what we're going to do is switch over into Microsoft Visual Studio Code here. We're going to start completely from scratch, make sure there's no smoke and mirrors here. We're just going to create a new application as we typically would with the Rust tool chain. And of course, if you don't have the Rust tool chain, you can always install that from rustup.rs. So if you head out to rustup.rs, you can just run this script here to install the rustup installer, and then you can use rustup to actually install the stable or beta or nightly tool chains for the Rust toolchain. Also, I have a website here called rustup.dev, not rustup.rs, but rustup.dev is my website where I write articles about how to use Rust and how to program in Rust. It's basically just my own verbiage about how I learn things and how I kind of structure my learning of things. So just yesterday, I actually wrote a new article on the match statement here that talks about some of the valid ways to use match statements and some of the errors, conditions that you can come across using match statements. I've got other things on functions and closures and other articles like that. So feel free to check back at rustup.dev on a regular basis to see if I've published any new articles. And feel free to leave a comment if there's specific topics that you need some clarity on. All right, so over here in VS Code, we're going to go ahead and create a new project here. So in the root of my Git directory, I'm just going to say cargo new, and then I'll call it Rust Inquire here. And I'm going to go ahead and open that up in my editor here. So I'll hit F1 in VS Code or Control Shift P, and I'll say open a folder. I'll do files, open folder, and then I'll say git slash rust inquire here and just open up that project folder in my editor. And as you can see, we have a pretty typical project here with our main.rs file, our hello world function, and no dependencies, right? So what we're going to do typically is start by installing the necessary crates that we need. So what we're going to do is say cargo add, and then we're going to add inquire. And as you can see, there are some optional features available. So in this feature list that we have right up here, we have things like the date option here, if we want a date picker. We also have the editor option if we want to create an inline editor where you can actually type some text, some multi-line text, and then maybe feed that into a configuration file or something of that nature. So we have a couple of optional features here. So what I'm going to do is say cargo add inquire, but then I'm going to specify the features of, for now, just the date editor here, or date selector, I should say. And that's going to allow us to choose dates using a really nice control in the terminal that I really like. All right, so now we've got this dependency here. There's another dependency that I'm going to add in here as well, just for a little bit of usefulness. So it's called colorize here. If you ever want to write colorized text to your terminal, the colorize crate makes it really easy to accomplish that. And so since we're building a terminal-based application here, I figured I'll go ahead and just add colorize. Now that we've got our dependencies installed right here, we can go ahead and open up our source directory, go into main.rs, and we can start writing some code. I'm also going to pull up the documentation for Inquire. So if we go over to the docs.rs website right here, there's actually a link right on the GitHub project page that'll take us straight to the documentation. This is really helpful as you start to dive into some of the more advanced features of the Inquire crate. They do provide a simple example right down here. So this kind of shows building a validator function. This is one of the nice advanced features that's available, is the ability to actually validate user input that's been selected. You can also look at the result here and say if you got an OK result or if you got an error result. You can actually prompt a user and they can hit the escape key to cancel or abort the input field that you've specified. And so if you get an error during the input specification, you can actually just report that and say, hey, you didn't specify something in here and your application can panic. So what we want to do for starters is take a look at some of the different data structures that are available down here. We have things like the simple text or confirm inputs here. You can actually construct instances of those data structures if you want to, but they actually have some helper functions down here as well. If you are really starting with the bare bones basics, these helper functions that you have right down here are kind of your primary entry point into prompting for certain types of input. So if you just want a simple confirmation prompt, you can just call the prompt confirmation function at the root of the Inquire crate. But if you want some more advanced features and you want to kind of customize the prompt a little bit, then you'll want to come up to the data structures here, maybe go into something like the select prompt here. And then this has some different methods that allow you to customize. So these with methods here allow you to say like, hey, I want to customize the page size. When I'm displaying the number of items to the user, I want to show 6 items at a time or maybe 10 items at a time, just kind of depending on maybe like what your terminal height is or something of that nature. You can also add things like help messages. You can add something called a scorer function. This is kind of an advanced feature that we're not going to go over, but that kind of allows you to prioritize certain items in the list based on maybe an item that's been recently accessed or something of that nature. So there's a lot of customization that you can get into here. There's also formatters that allow you to kind of format the output from the user. And there's also things like custom parsers in here, but we're just going to start with some of the basics. So let's take a look at maybe the prompt confirmation function here and just say, hey, are you ready to proceed? Yes or no? And we'll get that Boolean result from this. And then we'll go take a look at some more advanced things like the text input action here. We'll take a look at the select. Actually, I want these data structures up here. So we'll take a look at the select and the multi-select and the date select here as well, because there's a lot of advanced features here depending on what your use case is. So what we're going to do for starters right up here is just print out a line that says, "Are you ready to proceed?" Question mark. And then I'm going to bring in that colorize crate. So to use colorize, we say use colorize and then do a double colon and then say ANSI color. And this is a trait that allows us to use certain function calls on string types in Rust. So what I can actually do right here is just say, "Are you ready to proceed?" And then I could say something like dot green. And I actually need to put in a placeholder here as well, because we can't do that directly into the print line macro. But if we do a placeholder here and then pass in this string and then format it with the green function here, that will use whatever the terminal's default green color is to colorize that text. So for example, let's go right down here and say cargo run. And you'll see this is technically green, even though it doesn't look like green just based on my color theme. It is green, but if I made it something more obvious, like let's say yellow, then you can see that that's now yellow text. So I really like to use that colorize crate to just kind of add some custom colors. You can also do RGB based colors as well. So if you take a look at like, I think it's, you can do things like red, you can do green, but then there's like RGB values that you can add in there. We're not going to get into that right now, but you can get a little bit more advanced if you want to. All right, so now that we're going to print out that line there, we're going to say inquire. So we're going to go into the inquire crate here, and then we're going to look for the prompt confirmation function. And so what this is going to do is it's going to give us a result with either a Boolean response or an inquire error if an error occurs during the prompt. Now the input to this function here is just a message. So technically I could take this message right here, and rather than having to have a separate print line statement, I could just take this, "Are you ready to proceed?" I could comment out that print line statement, and then I can just pass it in right here instead. All right, so now what we want to do is capture the result of that. So we'll say let proceed as a variable. Go ahead and capture the result there. And now we can use the typical result types methods. We could say if, proceed dot is okay. Actually, we want, if it's error, then we want to maybe print out an error here. So say print line error occurred while checking if proceed, proceed. And then if there is no error, then let's actually do a return statement here as well. So if there is no error, then we'll go ahead and say print line user selected to proceed with application. All right, so now we can do a cargo run here, and we're not using print line anymore. This time we are just using the prompt library or inquire crate here, and we're saying, "Are you ready to proceed?" And we'll just say Y, and you can see that Y is short for yes, which means that we're ready to proceed. If we do cargo run and say yes, that also works as well. If we do cargo run and say, let's say N, then that also says that it's ready to proceed, right? But that's happening because we're not actually checking the Boolean value. We're only checking if there's an error condition so far. So an error condition would be something like if we hit escape right here. And so if we hit escape, you can see that that cancels or aborts the inquire prompt mechanism. And so that's going to trigger the error condition to occur. So basically, rather than having a Boolean as a return type here, the inquire error is actually getting populated. So when we check is error, then we are executing these lines of code right here. So what we need to do is actually check the Boolean value that's coming from this result when we validate. After we validate that there's no error, we want to say, all right, down here, now we actually want to check if there's a Boolean value. So we'll say if proceed dot unwrap. And so that's going to basically grab the Boolean value. It's going to unwrap it from the result type. And then it's going to say, if it's true, then the user selected to proceed. Otherwise, we'll print line and say user is not okay with proceeding. And then I'll also turn that into a colored line just so we can see kind of a warning color here. So I'll say dot yellow. And then what we're going to do is do a cargo run, and we'll say Y for yes. And so this case, you can see the user selected to proceed. If we say N for no, now it correctly says that the user is not okay with proceeding. So if we run and we type out yes, that works okay. If we run and say NO, that works okay. And you can see that it's automatically figuring out which of those are going to determine if it's a yes or no. So we can plug in an N, we can plug in an NO, we can plug in Y or YES. It doesn't really matter. It's kind of figuring that out for us. So now that we've figured that out, let's go ahead and try to do something a little bit more advanced here. So let's do a text-based prompt. I'm just going to go ahead and take this code right here and refactor it into a prompt Boolean function right down here, just so we can kind of segment that out. And I'm going to create another function here called prompt text, just to keep things separate from each other. And then I'll call the prompt text function from my main function. All right, so I'm just going to minimize prompt Boolean. We don't need that right now. And so in prompt text here, what we're going to do is go to the inquire crate, and we can say prompt. There's a lot of different data types that we can prompt for right here. But if I take a look at prompt text right here, once again, I have an input as a message. So maybe what is your player name? Or what is your first name? What is your last name? What is your address? What is your state? What is your city? What is your zip code? Kind of things like that that we might need to capture from a user. And once again, it's going to give us a result type, but this time it's going to give us a string rather than a Boolean because we're just plugging in arbitrary text. We're not trying to resolve that to a true or false value like we did with the confirmation prompt. So in this case, I'll go ahead and say, let's do a message or prompt message equals what is your player name? Okay. And then maybe I'll do dot yellow there just to make it a little bit more interesting. That's going to give us a string right there. Then I'll go ahead and pass that in. And let's capture the result as player name. And so now we're going to get this result type that wraps a string or an error. Now, another thing that we can do, instead of having this more complex code like we did right down here, where we check if there's an error or not, and then unwrap, another option that we have in Rust, when we have the result type here, is actually to do a dot expect. So what expect is going to do is it'll panic if for some reason there's an error that occurs, but this is going to give us a very specific error message so that we know where things failed inside of our code. So what I'll do is say dot expect and say failed to capture player name. So now if our application panics and we see failed to capture player name, we know about where in our code, it could be, thousands of lines of code that we have to sort through. Now we know kind of where to narrow down the bug in the application code is happening. And so what this is going to do as well is it's also going to automatically unwrap. So rather than getting the result type back, it's actually going to unwrap the string from the result for us because we're no longer having to handle the error condition ourselves. Instead, it's just going to panic with this expect error right down here. This is another syntax that you can use. I personally kind of like doing the checking of is error because it just gives me a little bit more control over how things are working here and then unwrapping the value. But a lot of people that are writing Rust code kind of advocate against that pattern, just in favor of using the expect approach here. So what we're going to do is just say print line and say your player name is, X, and then we'll put in player name dot yellow. We'll just format the player name as yellow in our print line statement right here. Let's do a cargo run. And so sure enough, we have a yellow message for our prompt right here. It says, what is your player name? And I'll say Trevor because I'm boring. And now you can see it prints out your player name is Trevor, and Trevor's in yellow because we formatted the player name string with the yellow function from the ANSI color right here. All right, so this is pretty cool functionality, but there's a lot more that we could do. For example, what if we wanted to validate the text input from the user? So one of the things that you might want to do is look at the first character of the name, and you might always want to validate that the first character of the person's name is a capital letter, right? And so how can we accomplish that? Well, at the moment, our application actually allows lowercase first letters, right? So I can have a lowercase t as the first character, but if I want to validate that the user input always starts with a capital letter, we can create a validator function. Now, if we go into the child modules of Inquire here, there is a validator child module, and there are a few built-in validators. In fact, they expose some macros at the root of the crate here, like length. There's a macro that'll do length checking using the exact length validator. There's a max length that'll check the maximum length of a string value or minimum length. There's also one down here that says required, so it'll just make sure that you don't have an empty string value. But what we want in this particular case is a little bit more advanced, right? So in this example right up here, their validator that they're using is checking the number of characters. So this is kind of similar to the max length character. I don't want you to have any more than 140 characters for your name. But in our case, we have custom logic. We have a custom requirement. We want the name to start with a capital letter. The input to the validator for a text type here is going to be a borrowed string value. So what we can actually do is break that borrowed string into individual characters using the same chars function that they use in this particular example. But then rather than looking at the count, we're just going to grab the first character and we're going to compare that character to an ASCII chart. So we're going to say, hey, does this character fall within the range of lowercase letters or not, right? And so we want to make sure that it is in the range of, actually in this case, uppercase characters. And so that will allow us to either return a validation of invalid. So this validation type actually comes from this crate as well. And so we can wrap a custom error message inside of the invalid statement here, and we can give a specific error as to why validation failed in our custom validator. Otherwise, if it does pass validation, then we can just return validation valid, a number enumeration type, and that will allow it to pass validation instead. So what we're going to do is come back over here and we are going to create a closure. Now I have a separate video that talks about closures, but closures in short are basically just functions that are kind of in line. So we're not creating a separate function block like we are here, but we're actually defining a function and storing it in a variable so that we can pass that function around to things like the validator. So what we're going to do is say let's say name validator, and we're going to set it to a closure. So here's my closure, and the input is going to be a borrowed string type. So I'll just do I as a borrowed string. And then inside the body of this closure function, we want to check I, which is the input string that the user typed into the input prompt. And we want to check to see what the condition is. And so in this case, we're going to say I got dot chars, and this is going to return chars to us, which is an iterator. And then we're going to grab the next item, which is the first item in the iterator. So I'll say first char is the first character in here, and then we want to unwrap that. Okay, so now we just have a char right here, and then I think I can also do as U8 to convert the char into a U8 value. So now I have an unsigned 8-bit integer that tells me which character this is. So what I can do now is go over to Wikipedia and take a look at an ASCII chart right here and figure out the decimal values that map to uppercase characters and determine if the first character is or isn't an uppercase character. So in this table right down here, it's under the printable characters heading right here. We have a typical ASCII table with the decimal or base 10 values. And so in this bright cyan right here, we want values from 65 all the way up to 90. So if our first character of the validator is anywhere from 65 up to and equal to 90, then we pass validation. Otherwise, we fail validation because the first character is either a lowercase letter or some other random special character. It could be maybe a slash like 92, or it could be the number 9, like which is a 57 right here. So we can basically just check if it's 65 through 90, we're good to go. If it's not, then we need the user to re-enter their name. So what we're going to do is just do a simple if block right here. We'll say if the first char is, actually, we're going to do a match statement here. So we're going to say match first char. And we're going to say if it's 65 all the way up to and equal to 90, then we're going to put a fat arrow here. And in this code block here, we're just going to return valid. Okay. So we'll say return, and then we want to return OK and say validation and valid. Okay. So that'll automatically import the Inquire validator validation enumeration right up here. And then we're going to return valid here. All right. So next, we want to say if anything else happens. So we're going to do a wildcard match, which is the underscore character right here. And so if anything else matches, then we want to return OK, which sounds kind of weird because normally you would think you would return error type. But in this case, we're actually going to return the invalid type or variant of the validation enumeration. And then we can plug in a custom error message in here. So what we'll say is, please make sure the first character is a capital letter. And then we'll just call .into, and that will convert the string into the necessary error message type that is used by this library. All right, so it looks like we have a type annotation issue here. Let me see what's going on here. And I think the reason that it needs these type annotations here is because the closure that we have right here doesn't currently declare the return type here. So what we are going to do in this particular case is go over to the Inquire crate, go to the validator submodule right here, and we're going to take a look at the string validator, which is a trait that receives a string slice as input for the text and password types here for validation. And we're just going to grab this return type right here, which is the declared return type that actually comes from the trait itself. So it's going to return a result of type validation or custom user error. And we need to import custom user error. So we'll just say either qualify or import. I'll go ahead and just do import. That'll add it to our import list right up here on line number 2. And now that we have those type annotations for the return type, we are good to go here. So now we've got this closure here with this function signature that is assigned to a variable called name validator. To actually do the validation, all we have to do is call one of the functions on the string validator itself. If we take a look at the data structures down here and take a look at the text prompt data structure for Inquire, and we take a look at the methods, there is a with function here that's called with validator. And what this will do is it will add the validator function that we just declared to the list or collection of validators, because you're not just limited to one validator. You can actually have multiple validator functions that you declare separately, and then you can call those validators in line with each other to make sure that the final output actually passes validation of all those different types of checks. So what we're going to do down here is just say .with validator. Actually, we need to do things a little bit differently here. Previously, we were using the prompt text helper function. What we're going to do this time instead is actually to construct the text prompt itself. We're going to say let player name equal inquire text new, and then we'll pass in our message, which is the prompt message variable right there. And then now that we have a text data structure here, we can now call .with validator, and then we can pass in the name validator that we have right up here. So let's go ahead and paste that in. And then we're also going to just copy this expect line right here, get rid of that semicolon, and paste that in here as well. And then I'll just go ahead and comment out this old example that we had right here. And the reason that we're getting this error here saying no method named expect is because when you construct the type here, so if I construct a select or a text or a confirmation, whatever data structure it is that I'm constructing, I actually have to call the dot prompt function in order for the prompt to actually get executed. So I can kind of construct the data structure like a text, and then I can configure it with validators and other customizations. But until I actually call the prompt function on that type itself, it's not actually going to proceed with the prompt and then return the result back to us. So now when I call prompt, it's going to give us the result with the string and the inquire error. And then I can use the expect function on that result to panic with that custom error message there. And now player name, once again, is a string type right here. So let's test out this validator function that we have now written right up here. So if the first character of the input string is anywhere from values 65 to 90, we should be good to go. Let's go ahead and do a cargo run right here, and we'll type a player name of lowercase t Trevor. And now you can see it continues to prompt us because we have not yet passed validation. I could try something like Shelly, and once again, we're just going to continue to get that error until I use a capital letter. So capital T Trevor works. If I do capital S for Shelly, that works as well. If I try it again and say Melissa, whoops, misspelled that. Melissa, there we go. You can see that we passed validation as well. So any of those capital letters should work fine. I could try like Zeus, for example, but if I do lowercase z for Zeus, that's going to fail validation as well. So that custom validation function that we wrote is working pretty darn well. All right, so now that we've taken a look at the text prompt type in Inquire, let's also take a look at the select type here. I really like the select because oftentimes you'll need somebody to select something from a list of options. In the cloud industry that I work in, you oftentimes will have to select a specific region where you want to deploy cloud resources into, or maybe even something like a specific availability zone. And so in that case, where you have a list of regions that you want to deploy to, and you just need to select one of those regions, the select control here is the perfect opportunity to do something like that. So we'll go ahead and comment out the call to the prompt text function here that we are currently done with. And then I'll do fn prompt select. And let's go ahead and call that from my main function so I don't forget to later on and embarrass myself. So now in the prompt select function here, we could either go to the root of the crate, take a look at the helper functions down here, and we have helper functions for things like dates, secrets, passwords, text, confirmation, and things like that, but we don't have any helper functions for the select type. So in this case, we have to go ahead and actually construct an instance of this select type here. So we're just going to use the new method, and the new method on the select type is a little bit different than the text type because we still have to pass in a prompt message. But the second parameter that we pass in to the new function on the select or multi-select types is actually a list or a vec of type T that can be an arbitrary generic type. That's going to be the list of options that we're actually presenting to the user. So what we're going to do is create a vec that contains a bunch of different options. Then we'll construct the select type with a new function here with a custom prompt, and then pass in those list of options. And then as a result, we'll get back when we actually call the prompt here. Then we're going to get this inquire result here, where we get the result wrapping the final result, which should be a string value because we're going to pass in strings as our options, and then an optional inquire error here as well. So let's go back over to our function here. And the first thing that we'll do is go ahead and specify a list of items. So let's say that maybe I wanted to select a player class. So in a game, maybe I have a list of player classes. I'll say let player classes equal a vec. And then in the vec here, we'll say something like druid, we'll say cleric, we'll say archer, we'll say warrior, and maybe wizard as well. So there we go. Now we have this vec of type borrowed string where we have 5 different options for the player of this made up game to select from. Now what we can do is create a select prompt and then pass in this vec of player classes into that select prompt. Let's go down here and say let select equal, let's actually do select equals inquire, select, and then new. And again, we have these two inputs here. So we have the prompt. Let's go ahead and construct a variable with the prompt message and say, please select your player class. And we'll pass in the prompt message as a parameter here. And then for the options here, this is where we're going to pass in player classes. That's our vec of borrowed strings where we can just prompt for these options here. Now, once we have created the select, then we can go ahead and call the prompt function on it. That's going to give us the final result right here. And then we can also use the expect here and say failed to select player class, just so that we know where the panic is occurring in our code. All right, so once we've selected the player class, then we'll go ahead and say print line, you selected the player class of placeholder, and then we'll pass in select dot yellow, just so we have a highlighted text right there. And that should be pretty much everything that we need here. Now, I will point out that validators also work on other types here. So we can use on the select type here, we could also create a validator on here as well. But we've already looked at how to do that with the text type down here. And all you need to know as far as implementing the validator type for other types is to go to the validator module right here. And then down here, you can actually see the different options that are available. So if we have like a multi-select, for example, we could use the multi-option validator to actually validate multiple options that are being selected from a multi-select. So there are different validators depending on what you are validating. There's also a custom date validator here as well. So it just kind of depends on what data type you're prompting for that determines what type of validator you're going to end up using. But because we already discussed validators for the text type, we'll go ahead and just skip that for the select type here. So let's go ahead and do a cargo run. And down here, you can see I get this prompt saying, please select your player class. So I can select Archer, and it'll print out Archer in yellow there. I can go ahead and run again and say Cleric. It'll print out Cleric. And I could go ahead and specify something else like Wizard, and that works perfectly fine. Now, one of the things that I love about the Inquire crate is that there's some built-in features that you get for free without having to write any additional code in the select type here. So one of the things that I could do is actually do a search. So I could type any character like C, and it'll do a full text search on each of the items in the select list, the items that were passed in, and it will filter that list so that I can just see the list, the items that match the particular search. So if I wanted to search for Z, Wizard is the only item that matches Z. If I wanted to search for maybe like double R's, or maybe just R, I guess it's doing a full text search despite the spaces in there. But what we can do is just see that we have Warrior and Archer that both match double R's. Now, if I do triple R's, you can see that in that case, only the Warrior type matches that, not the Archer class, because the Archer has 2 R's, whereas the Warrior actually has 3 R's. So it's doing a little bit of advanced filtering there, but that just makes it really easy to select items from the list here. Now, something else that you can do is to just use the arrow keys to select from items here. And in the multi-select, you actually have some other options that are available as well. So let's go ahead and take a look at multi-select instead. I'm going to go ahead and copy these player classes from here for starters, and we're going to allow the player to select multiple player classes in this particular case. Let's do a function called prompt multi select, and then we'll go ahead and paste in those player classes and the prompt. But this time we're going to change the prompt to select your player classes because we're going to allow selection of multiple classes. And what we're going to do is actually construct inquire multi-select new. And once again, when we call new here, we pass in the prompt message and we pass in the vec of options here. Let's go ahead and pass in our prompt message right here. And then we'll also pass in the player classes variable, pass in player classes right here. and then we'll call dot prompt, and then we'll call dot expect and just say failed to select multiple player classes. All right. So now the result from this, let's do a variable called selected classes to capture the result. Now the result is actually going to be a vec of strings. So we're passing in a vec of strings as inputs, but because we can select multiple items, we can actually get a response that has more than one item so that that's wrapped in a vec as well. So it's basically a way for us to kind of filter the inputs down to just the ones that the user actually wants to select. So now what we can do is iterate and say for selected item in the selected classes, we can just say you selected X class, and we'll pass in the selected item. So we should get multiple statements printed out for each execution of this. Let me make sure I called that from my main function. Say prompt multi-select right here, do cargo run. So now down here, instead of just having the caret showing which item is currently selected by the cursor, which I can use the up and down arrow keys for, I can actually use the space bar to select individual items right here. Also, there is the right arrow key to select all items or the left arrow key to select none. So if I just hit the right arrow key, that'll select everything in the list. If I hit left arrow key, that will select none of the items in the list. And again, I can use filtration here. If I said Z, I can select wizard, I can erase the filter, and then I could say, show me all the ones with I in the name. All right, let's select that one as well, remove the filter, and I can continue to see the rest of the options. So that's a really nice feature that I like about the Inquire crate. It's just the ability to, filter items, to select all items really easily if you need to select none of the items and then just check off specific ones, as well as being able to filter to certain items that are inside of that list. So multi-select options are really nice. Let's go ahead and actually run that. Just choose a couple of options here. And now you can see that we selected 3 different items from that list of player classes. All right. So we've looked at the text type, the confirmation type, the select type, the multi-select type here as well. And we also have the date selector. I really like the date selector because it's kind of a unique feature in this particular crate. So let's do another function here called prompt date and put in my empty parentheses there. And let's call that from the main function right up here. All right, so now we are going to switch over to looking at the date type. We have a date select option right here. And again, that has the asterisk next to it because it's an optional feature. You can see right down here, the editor and date select prompts are available by enabling the editor or date features. And when we did a cargo install, we made sure to install the date feature. All right, so in the function here, we're going to say let selected date equal inquire date select new, and this is going to provide a prompt. So let's say let prompt equal select the player's birth date. And we'll go ahead and pass that in as prompt. And then we're going to call the prompt function. And then we're going to do dot expect and say failed to select player's birth date and terminate that. All right, now this is going to use another crate called the chrono crate. And the chrono crate actually has a data type in it called the naive date. So one of the things that I'm going to do is come down here and say cargo install the chrono crate here. And looks like I'm getting an error here. Cargo add chrono. I don't know why I was thinking install, but cargo add chrono to our project here. And if we open up cargo.toml, you can see there is chrono right there. And chrono has this type called a naive date. And when you call the Inquire crate with the date select feature and you actually run the prompt here, it returns that naive date back to you. So what we're going to do is say print line and say you selected X date. So we'll put in a placeholder there and we'll just pass in the selected date. All right. So what we could do is also say selected date dot format, and then you can use different format strings in here. So if I look for strf time format, Wikipedia. I'm sure there's an article that talks a little bit about this here. So if I wanted to get something like the month, let me find a different list here. Let's do strf time format in Rust Chrono. Maybe that'll give me some better options here. All right, so in here, we can see we've got things like the year. It gives you an example. We have things like month. So if we do %m, that'll give us the numeric month with a preceding 0 if it's a single digit. If we want the full month, we can do %b and things of that nature. So we can actually extract individual parts from it by using the format string here. So what we could do is say use selected and then do year percent capital Y, and then month would be percent capital B, and then we'll do month percent B, and then day we'll do, let's say percent lowercase d, and that is A, and then we'll do percent capital A so that we know what day of the week that particular date is. So I think this ought to work right here. So let's go ahead and do a cargo run right here. And as you can see, it currently selects the day that it is today. So August 11th is today, but I could just pick kind of a random day here using the arrow keys and hit enter. And now I can see you selected 2024, May 1st, and that is a Wednesday, right? So this is just a nice way to pick a date for your application. So to kind of put this together, let's say that maybe we had a player data structure, something really simple, and we wanted to maybe have a player name. We have a data structure called player, and we have a player name. That's a string data type. The player's birth date, that is a naive date. And let's say that we had a list of player classes, which could be a vec of strings. Actually, let's do a capital S string right here. And so now what we can do is construct an instance of the player, and we can use these different prompts to select the various bits of data to construct that player. So what we could do is from the date function right here, we could return a naive date from this. And so what we'll do is go down here and just return the selected date from the function here. And then for the multi-select right here, we could return a vec of strings, and that would represent the player classes that we have right here. And I'm actually going to turn all these into regular strings for our inputs here. And then down here, we are expecting, it looks like something slightly different. Let's see what's going on here. I think that should work okay. But expected a vec of string O is the return value. So what we're going to do is just say, instead of using these here, we're just going to say return the selected classes. That'll return a vec of string from prompt multi-select function. And then the other thing that we're going to do is go to the text prompt right here, and we're just going to return the player name. So that'll just be a standard string value. It'll return a string from the prompt text function. And down here, we'll go ahead and return the player name. And we'll comment out the print line call right there that's consuming the player name. And so now what we can do is in our main function, right up here, we can go ahead and construct an instance of the player. So what we'll do is say player, and then we'll say that the player name is whatever the result of the prompt text function is. And then we'll say that the classes of the player is whatever the prompt multi-select function returns. Let's actually put that on a new line so we have common indentation there. And then finally, the player's birth date will be whatever the prompt date returns here. All right, so let's go ahead and indent that, put a semicolon at the end, and we'll say let P1 equal player. So just like that, we've declared a player data structure that has a few fields on it, name, classes, and birth date. And we have a few functions that are going to help us to construct this player instance so that we can use that player in the rest of our game. So now if I do a cargo run on this application, the first thing that's going to happen is we're going to go into the main function and we're going to start to construct the player. But the first thing in order to construct the player is that we need to know its name. So it calls prompt text function. So our player name is Trevor. We can select the player classes. I'll just select cleric and wizard and hit enter. And then the third thing is going to be the birth date. So it calls the prompt date function right here. And we could specify a birth date, maybe going back a while here, and hit enter. And we selected that particular year, date, and day. And so now we have constructed an instance of this player class, and we could implement methods on it like, do damage or, take damage or things like that, or maybe have a hit points field on that player so we know how many hit points the player currently has and things like that. But just to get the essentials of the player here, we can very easily prompt the player for input by using the Inquire crate for Rust. So anyways, I hope this has been helpful for you. I really like the Inquire crate because it just makes building simple interactive applications really, really easy. It doesn't have a lot of advanced features, but it's a really basic way to just capture some useful information. So please check out the Rust Inquire crate, write some applications with it, play around with it, and hopefully you enjoy it as much as I do. But in any case, thanks so much for watching this video, and I will see you in the next video. Please leave a like, please subscribe to the channel, leave a comment down below, and let me know what you thought of this video. Thanks again, and take care.